Thanks for coming to this session on how to make a happy marriage. For all of you who are, well, pretty much everybody here, you're an influencer. You have, as I was telling the people in the last breakout session, you have been given this incredible gift by God of being put in a position to really influence others, to influence the people who work with you, to influence our culture in a way that a lot of people don't have. And one of the things that means for you is that you also really need to be attuned to being an influence in how your personal life runs. Because we all know that, especially as believers, especially as those who try to follow the ways of Christ, we all know that our marriage is supposed to be a reflection of Christ in the church. We all know that our marriage is supposed to look like the closeness that the Trinity have with each other, that, God says, this is me and Jesus. And sometimes it feels like that, and sometimes it doesn't. And so I've been studying what are the things that make it feel like that? What are the things that are going to lay the really, really great foundation? Because sometimes when you get into issues in your marriage, it can just feel like a snowball that just feels really hopeless. There are a lot of, it looks like really big issues, almost insurmountable. How are we going to solve this? And they look so big and overwhelming that sometimes it's easier to kind of just back off and focus on work or focus on the kids or whatever it is, and not necessarily be able to focus on putting that strong foundation back underneath us. So I want to start by talking about giving you an example of something that has absolutely nothing to do with marriage, but actually applies the main principle that we're going to be referring to over and over again really well. When I read this book a number of years ago, some of you might have read it too, called Switch by Chip and Dan Heath. Anybody read this book? Great book, okay? Chip and Dan Heath, brothers out here somewhere, and they studied what are the things that allow you to change something well. How do you change something? How do you change a mind? How do you change a department at work? How do you change a marriage? What does it look how do you change something? And they used an example that I instantly knew had huge applications to what I do as a researcher, especially in the area of relationships. They told this story of a man named Jerry Sternin, who worked for UNICEF, who worked for the Children's Development Fund of the United Nations. And he and his team were tasked with trying to solve and address a problem that was huge in Southeast Asia. This was, quite a few years ago, the problem of systemic childhood malnutrition. So just all these countries in Southeast Asia, there were millions and millions of kids that were really, really suffering from malnutrition, and it was affecting everything in their society, and it looked big and overwhelming. And they would go into these countries, and they would spend millions and millions of dollars. But it was really hard to tackle something that systemic, and nothing really was changing. Because how are you going to solve, in quotes, solve something as big as childhood malnutrition? I mean, think about it. You have to solve poverty. Like, how on earth do you solve poverty, right? What are the causes underneath malnutrition? Okay, so poverty would be one. Another one would be, how do you solve corruption? Like, there was tons of aid going in. There was tons of food going into these countries, but it was being diverted. It wasn't reaching the people it was intended to reach. So how on earth do you solve corruption? Another reason for malnutrition is there's issues with the water. And so, so now we have to build water filtration plants. It was big and overwhelming. And so Jerry Sternin with his team, they finally said, wait a minute. He said, this is basically, you guys have heard that quote that's attributed to Albert Einstein, like the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over and over again and expect a different result. And so he said, okay, this is crazy. We're going to go into the next country and we're going to do the same thing and we're going to spend millions of dollars and it's not going to have an impact. So let's completely rethink this. And he said, the next country was Vietnam that they were going into. And he said, not every child in Vietnam is malnourished. Some of them are doing just fine. So instead of spending multi-millions of dollars on efforts that aren't going to work, let's spend a few $100,000 and go in to all of the villages in Vietnam and find the kids that are well-nourished, find the bright spots, he called them, and find what is common amongst all of those and see if they have anything in common that can be a lesson to us. And so they went in across Vietnam, and they interviewed all the parents, and they found these kids, and they found these kids. And they looked at all of them, and they were worried as they looked at them that they were going to find all these big, unsustainable, unrepeatable things that were the common denominators. Like they were worried that all the kids would be the kids of the village chief, for example. You know, the rich kids. That wasn't it. They were worried they were all going to be concentrated in one more relatively prosperous geographic area. That wasn't it. They discovered there was one thing in common amongst all these kids. When the moms would make their porridge or their gruel in the mornings, it was considered low class amongst most of the population. When the moms dipped the water out of the river to mix it in with the porridge, they would strain out all the stuff that was floating in the water because it was low class to have all the little, vegetation, all this little stuff floating in the water. And so normally the moms would strain it out and then make the porridge. The kids that were well-nourished, the moms didn't do that. They dipped it out of the water and out of the river, and they put it directly in their porridge. And in the process, they were not straining out all the little vegetables and all the little shrimp in the water. These kids were getting more vegetables and getting more protein than all the other children. And Jerry Sternin realized, wait a minute, we don't have to solve poverty and corruption and water filtration plants. We need to teach the moms to not strain out the shrimp. Okay? One simple-ish change, and it solved the systemic problem of childhood malnutrition in Vietnam. Solved it. Now, of course, there are still malnourished children in Vietnam, but as a systemic, society-wide problem, it solved it. And they went in, they did it with all these other countries, and it has completely transformed the way that UNICEF approaches and a lot of other development agencies approach those kinds of problems, to look for the bright spots and to see how can we replicate that. And when like I said, when we're having marriage issues, it can seem big and overwhelming. It can seem like there's all these things that we have to do. And instead, there is a principle here that is incredibly important about looking for the bright spots and seeing what those role models, the people who have the happiest marriages, have to teach us. And so that became this massive research study that I did after I did the ones for women only and for men only that Shelley was talking about, that I did for the book, The Surprising Secrets of Highly Happy Marriages, where I was studying what the most happily married couples did differently. Because I realized, it's so common when we are trying to address this, that if we have issues, it's almost like, the common thing, if you have a problem, it's natural to sort of dig into the problem and try to figure out what it is and surface the problem and focus on it. What happened in my childhood and what happened with this and why am I responding this way, and focusing on the problem so you can correct it. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that has to happen often. But I realize that's the majority of what we often do in counseling and just naturally in any conversation about marriage issues. And if that's all we're focusing on, that means we're only focusing on the problems. And I realized, wait a minute, we have to look at the role models. I mean, come on, we all in this room want to look like Jesus, right? If you want to look like Jesus, you don't study the Pharisees. So what is it that will allow us to find those people, those happy couples, and replicate their success? So that's what this project was. And just really briefly, because I want to get into what we found, but as we started this, I was worried that we would find the equivalent, the same thing that Jerry Sternin was worried about in Vietnam. I was worried as I started trying to locate the most happily married couples and study what they did differently. I was worried that I would find all these big things that you can't really replicate that aren't helpful. Like, I was worried I would find that they all came from intact families. And it's no help to tell a marriage who's struggling, a couple who's struggling, oh, sorry, your parents shouldn't have gotten divorced. Like, that's not helpful. I was worried that I would find that, all these couples that had the more happy marriages, that they had more financial resources to draw on, or that they all had temperaments that got along perfectly well. The kinds of things that you can't necessarily change. And thankfully, that is not what I found at all. As we did this study over the course of about 3 years, what we found is that it wasn't the big things that made the difference. It was a bunch of little ones. Little ones, frankly, that these happy couples didn't even know that they were doing differently. And what we were primarily focusing on was, what are these couples actually doing differently? Not what they say they're doing, not what the good, hope that they'll do at some point. What are they actually doing day to day? What little habits do they have that leads to it? So since I know we don't have time for questions at the end, since I know I will get this question if we had time, I'm going to share how we identified the most happily married couples before we go any further. Is that okay with you guys? Would you be interested in that piece of it? Okay. So, because I know everybody's like trying to figure out how we did that. So here's basically the shorthand version of what we did. Is essentially, we divided people into 3 categories by having them, as husband and wife, took surveys. Because what we do is we do a lot of the interviews, like what Shelley was talking about. We do hundreds and hundreds of interviews and focus groups and informal stuff. And then in the end, we do this massive, on all of the projects, we end with a massive nationally representative survey. And so on the survey, what we ended up doing was there was this, it'd take too long to explain, but there was a mechanism by which the husband and the wife, their surveys were matched, so we knew that they were married to each other, but they were taking it anonymously. We didn't know who they were. All we knew was their exact demographics. It was a 40-year-old black man in Indiana or whatever, okay? So we knew who they were married to each other, but they were anonymous, and they were taking it completely independent of each other. There is no way that the husband and the wife would ever know what the other person answered, so they could be completely honest. And we snuck in what's called a filter question in the middle of that. And the filter question looked like any other question, but it was our sneaky attempt to try to categorize them. The question was, are you generally happy in your marriage these days and enjoying being married? No, and the answers were 1 through 5. 1 was yes, exclamation point. Number 2 was yes, most of the time. 3 was sometimes yes, sometimes no. 4 was no, not really. And 5 was no, exclamation point, okay? And what we wondered was, if a husband and a wife, independent of each other, never knowing what the other person was saying, if they both answered yes, exclamation point, I'm very happy in my marriage, I'm enjoying being married, those are the people that I most wanted to talk to. Those are the people that I wanted to compare their answers to everybody else. The 3 groups were what we called the highly happy marriages, or the yes couples, right? Those couples. Then the second group was any couple that answered yes, exclamation point, or yes most of the time, but neither person answered 3, 4, or 5. Neither person said sometimes yes, sometimes no, or on down, because it was not uncommon that you might have someone say yes, exclamation point, and their spouse said, you would say that's not what you would call an actually happy marriage, right? I mean, it might be fine, but it's not one of those happy marriages. So we did the yes couples, the highly happy couples. The second group was the happy marriages, generally happy, normal marriages. And then the third group was where one or both parties answered sometimes or down. And so we compared what the highly happy couples did to the happy couples and to what we called the third group was the so-so or struggling couples. And that's where we identified, it turns out there were 12 little things that mattered. We're only going to get a chance to get into maybe 5 of them. So let me dive in. The first and the most important thing that the research found that is the only thing in any of our research studies that we've ever said this about, and this is a prerequisite for a happy marriage. We don't think you can be happily married without this. And that is that these happy couples chose to believe the best of their spouse's intentions, even when they were legitimately hurt. The happy couples chose to believe the best of their spouse's intentions, even when they were legitimately hurt. Everybody gets hurt. Every couple, even the most happily married couples, hurt each other's feelings. I love what one guy said when we were interviewing them, and they said, you got to realize that even the most awesome, godly Christian husband and wife can be a jerk sometimes. Everybody hurts each other's feelings sometimes. The issue is what you choose to believe about your spouse's intentions towards you when that happens. Because it is natural, it is a human tendency for us to naturally think, and let me, putting myself in a wife's point of view, if Jeff, my husband, if he hurts my feelings, it is a natural thing to subconsciously think, kind of this, ow, he knew how that would make me feel, and he said it anyway. And you don't realize it, but subconsciously what you're thinking is, he doesn't care about me. But we found that statistically, the vast majority of people do care. And the happy couples didn't do that. They switched it. So instead, when the hurt came, it was, ow, but no, I know he loves me. I know he cares about me, so he must not have known how that would make me feel, or he wouldn't have said it. And they switch it in their brain. Same thing with the husbands. It's a common thought for husbands subconsciously to think, nothing I do is ever good enough for her, okay? And no, I know she appreciates me, so she must not realize how that makes me feel. And that switch is what is 100% necessary to have the most happy and abundant marriage. And it actually matches with some of the studies that have been done that I think are fascinating. There was a study that was done by a professor at the University of Maryland. And they did this with a group of college students. I love college students because for $20, they will submit themselves to almost anything in the clinical setting. You can do almost any experiment on these kids. And so this study ended up being called The Power of Good Intentions, okay? And what these college students did is, or what the scientists did, is they had these students hooked up, they had these kids hooked up to all these electrodes to measure their physiological responses. And they also had a device that had a cord that would run behind a partition, and it would administer an electric shock, like a painful electric shock to these kids. And the kids were told one of three different things about the person on the other side that was hitting the button that was administering electric shock. Some of them were told that, they know that this is going to administer a shock, but they've been told but they think it's going to help you win money if they do this. So it's sort of good intentions towards them, right? The second group was told, oh gosh, that button, it's sort of in the wrong place and people just hit it accidentally, I'm sorry. Sort of that it was random. It wasn't intentional. It was unknown. The third group was told that, they kind of know they're hitting the button and they think it's kind of fun, to cause you some pain, right? So not good intentions. The level of the voltage, the shock, was exactly the same across all three groups, exactly the same. The physiological responses were totally different. If the people thought they were trying to help them win money, the shock registered, the pain registered at a fairly low level. If they were told that it was an accident, it was a little bit higher. And if they were told it was on purpose, the pain was higher. The physiological response was worse just because they thought that person had bad intentions. It works the exact same way in marriage. Your feelings will be hurt. you need to choose to believe that they didn't mean to do it that way, that they care about you. And the good thing is that's not just wishful thinking. We found on the survey that something like 99.37 something percent of people deeply care about their spouse. Even, by the way, this might shock you, it sort of shocked us, even in the most struggling marriages, even in the marriages where they were at the most sort of desperate place in their marriage, it was something like 97 point something. Almost everybody cares. The key is whether you choose to believe it. So let's move on to the next topic. The next issue is that we found that one of the secrets of the most happily married couples was something that, again, they didn't really realize that they were doing. Some people were doing this on purpose, but often it was just sort of something that they had discovered worked, and it was just a part of sort of daily life. And that is that the wives all tended to do the same 5 little things for their husbands, and the husbands tended to do the same 5 little things for their wives. Now, this wasn't like the 5 love languages where you find the 5 things that matter the most to your spouse and do them every day. That matters. It's obviously a big deal. But no, we were actually shocked to find, no, these 5 exact things really matter to husbands, and these 5 things really matter to wives. And so what happened was, as each spouse did these little things without half the time even realizing that they were doing them or they were a big deal, what was happening in the heart of their spouse is it was building up this feeling, subconsciously, this is all subconscious, building up this feeling that my spouse cares about me. And building up this reservoir of goodwill so that when those inevitable shocks happened, it was easier to believe the best of their spouse because they know that they are cared for. They feel cared for. So what were those things? We don't have time to get into all of them right here, but let me just mention a couple on each side. The happy wives, for the husbands, they tended to tell their husbands, thank you, a lot. We had been looking for years and years and years after having discovered in the study of men, something that is no surprise to any man, but is a surprise to most women, that men have a completely different insecurity running under the surface than we women do. And that if we women, if our insecurity, our question is like, am I lovable and does he really love me? The men's question is more, am I able? Like, am I any good at what I do? And there's a lot of insecurity around that. And we as women don't realize you big, strong men look so strong and confident. And on the inside, you're kind of like, I want to be a great husband, but I'm not sure I know what I'm doing. You know, somebody's going to find out I have no idea what I'm doing. And we didn't realize, we as women had no idea that you men have this self-doubt about being a husband, being a dad, being a salesman, being a CEO, whatever it is. We didn't know. And yet, and so the need of men is to feel appreciated and respected, and like my wife trusts me. And I thought, okay, that's good. You know, learning in For Women Only that my husband needs to know that I respect him. That's important. I love to hear I love you, so I need to say to my husband, you know, the parallel. So I would follow my husband around the house and be like, oh, honey, I respect you so much. And after a while, my poor husband was like, I'm sorry, that just, like, I know what you're trying to do, but it doesn't have the same ring to it. And so I had been looking for years to find out, what can a woman say to her husband that has the same emotional impact on him that I love you does on a woman? And in this study, we finally found it, and it's thank you. And it makes perfect sense, ladies, because if a man really has so much self-doubt, if that really is in our big, strong man, and if the question really is, man, I want to be good at this, but I'm not sure that I know what I'm doing, then what could be more powerful than saying, I noticed what you did, and it was good, and I appreciate it. And that's what thank you says. It hits all these notes, and it's the little things of life, not necessarily the big ones. It's thank you for noticing that the light bulbs were out and changing them. Thanks for coming home early to take the kids to soccer, when I wasn't feeling well. Thank you for, I know you were tired and you took the kids out into the yard and you played ball anyway. You're such a good dad. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And we have no idea how much that fills up a man in every way that he needs to be filled. These happy couples, the wives, half the time, they didn't even realize it was such a big deal to their husband, but it was one of the main reasons why they were so happy. Another thing that the wives tended to do for the husbands is, let's just say that he knew that she desired him sexually. She had shown him that she desired him sexually. And that was actually something that either it was something that was a big deal to her, so it was a big deal to them as a couple, or she knew that it was something that really mattered to her husband. And so she was making sure that she was thinking about making that a priority. And I wish we could go into more of the detail about what physical intimacy means to our husbands. We just don't have the time for that here. But suffice it to say that we women think of it as in marriage as being primarily a physical need. And it turns out that statistically for men, actually, it's the importance of it is primarily an emotional need to feel desired by his wife. And then that gives a man a sense of confidence and a sense of well-being and all the other areas of his life. That's something that is so unknown to so many of us as women. Now, for some women, we're flipped on this. There's plenty of couples where it's the wife who has the higher libido. But in the majority of cases, this is an area that absolutely tells our husband, I care about you, and gives him that certainty as sort of a buffer against the shocks of marriage. Okay, so flipping it, those are the little things that the wives tend to do for the husbands. Like I said, there were more of them. I wish we had time to get into them. The parallel side of things is what the husbands tended to do for the wives. And this is an area, again, where sometimes it was just a sort of a subconscious thing, but the husbands tended to show their wives physical signs of affection when they were out in public. And it's not like, yeah, I'm doing this because I want sex later. It was literally like the husbands would reach across and take their wife's hand when they were walking across a parking lot. Or when they were sitting together at church, or they were at dinner, and they were some public place, and they were sitting together, the husband would just reach over and put his arm around her in church, or put his hand on her knee. See, now all of the men who were sitting next to their wives are like, yeah, good job, buddy, good job, absolutely. Good job, okay. See, now any man who hasn't done that is like, dang, like if I do it now, it won't matter. And now, by the way, as a quick aside, when you see the other person do these things that I've been mentioning later, when she looks for something and says thank you, or you're sitting at church and he puts his arm around you, ladies or guys, you're not allowed to say, you are only doing that because she told you to, right? Believe the best. See how this works? Believe that was something, that's how they feel about you. They just didn't know that thing mattered. Like she had no idea that telling you thank you for loading the dishwasher made your day. She just had no idea that he didn't know that it mattered that much to have that sense of being encompassed in public as you're mine. That we just don't know that these things matter. So believe the best when your spouse tries those things. And guys, just be aware, we're talking about these little things. They really do. Another little sign that really mattered to show your love for your wife was things like texting her or leaving her a voicemail during the day, just as almost that, you have that flash. You're pretty busy at work, but every now and then like a flash comes across your brain of, how much you care about her. And if what the women said is, if literally you'll take 10 seconds and send that text message right when you're thinking of it to say, I can't believe I'm married to you. I love you so much. I can't wait to see you tonight. Or this has been such a rotten day. Everybody's been on my back. I can't wait to come home to you. I love you so much. It'll take you 10 seconds. But the women said things like, I saved that voicemail. Because it's a little thing, guys, but it really does matter. So that's one of the types of things that the happy husbands tended to do for the wives. Another thing is going to sound kind of funny, but every woman in the room knows how much this matters. Guys, you don't realize it, but when you have had a bad day or the two of you are a little bit at odds, you men can sometimes walk around with the black cloud of doom hanging over your head. Apparently nobody in here, this apparently impacts nobody in here, but honestly, sometimes you don't realize it, but when you're in that kind of things are just bad at work or things are bad between us or whatever, and you're grumpy and you have that black cloud hanging over your head, something is triggered in your wife that you have no idea is there. And it's a really important principle. And if you can grasp this, it changes everything. Just like if women can grasp just how much self-doubt is inside their man and speak into that, it changes everything. See, guys, what you don't realize about your wives is that she doesn't feel permanently loved just because you said, I do. For you, when you get married, the question of whether she loves me is that's sort of it. Like, it just doesn't come up in your head, really. And guys, you need to know, just because she walked down the aisle and you said your I do's, it's not like, okay, on to the next thing. Like, there is no switch in a woman's brain that gets flipped to the, oh, I feel permanently loved position. And that she has this question, just like you do, that is still there. Your question is, like I said, it's, am I able? Am I adequate? Do I measure up? Am I any good at what I do? Do I have what it takes? That question is in there. It's probably the result of the fall, right? It's just in there for you as a man. For her, the question is, am I lovable? Am I special? Am I beautiful? And that does not change just because she got married to you. In marriage, it just morphs to, does he really love me? Would he really love somebody like me? And if there's an issue, if there's a black cloud of doom following around, if you've had a conflict, that question gets triggered and it's rising up, and it's that you had that argument over breakfast and it's roiling in her gut, and it's this, are we okay? And it's a feeling like nothing is right with the world until that is resolved. Ladies, you know what I'm talking about, right? It is such a subtle and incredibly potent feeling. And so, guys, just think about it this way. When you have that argument over breakfast, you're emotional, there's a problem, you're like mad, and you've got to get to work. You've got a client meeting, you got to go. You get in the car, you back out of the driveway to go to work, and as you're driving away, what happens to the thought of that argument? Guys, click. It disappears. It's gone. Right. Ladies, in your mind, is it gone? No. No. Guys, what's happened is that underground question has risen up, and that's the, are we okay? And that is going to be roiling in her gut until she is reassured. A powerful message of love to your wife is what the happy husbands did, sometimes without even realizing that it was such a big deal, which is when you've had that conflict, to say something like, before you walk out the door, to say something like, look, I'm angry, black cloud of doom, I'm angry, I need to get to work, I need some space, I can't even talk right now, but listen, I want you to know we're okay. Oh, it's a huge issue for your wife. And even huger if you will recognize that the black cloud of doom itself can cause that insecurity and work to pull yourself out of that funk and shake it off. So that when you come back after work or when you come back an hour later from your workshop or whatever it is, that you're okay again. That is a priceless signal of love, even though you didn't realize that it was. So write down the words, we're okay, and that's huge, just like thank you is for a man. Okay, next topic, next little thing that we found, next secret of the happy couples that I want to tackle. This one actually cracked me up because this is a perfect example of where what the happy couples said to do sometimes was at complete odds with what they actually did. When Jeff and I were doing the research, often we would sit down, one of the ways that we would arrange interviews was if we were going to speak in a particular city, we would tell the organizer, okay, here's what we want. It's certain amount of time, that we're going to be on site. Here's how the marriage conference should be organized. The honorarium, the travel expenses. Like we'd go through all of that. And oh, by the way, because we're in the middle of this research project, one of the other things we need to do is to have you arrange 3 or 4 interviews, hour-long interviews, with one of the couples in your church that's the most happily married couple that we can interview. And you can sometimes get like, okay, maybe they're not as happily married as the church thought, but most of the time, these people were the ones who, on the survey, would have been the highly happy couples or the yes couples. And we just would dig into their lives and what their story was. And we wanted to get over, at the very beginning, before we dug into what their habits were, we wanted to find out what their advice was, because these happily married couples are asked for their advice all the time. And so we wanted to get it out on the table, sort of get it over with. Like, what do you think your secrets of why you're so happily married are? Which was, helpful. But almost always, one of the top 3 was, it's really important to not go to bed mad. It's really, really important to not go to bed mad. And so I would always say, oh, yes, absolutely, I totally agree. But do you ever go to bed mad? Well, it's a really important principle, and we tell young couples that when we do premarital counseling, it's like, no, I get it. I get that it's a really important principle, but that's not actually what I'm asking, Mr. and Mrs. Happy Couple. What I really want to know is whether you personally, do you ever go to bed mad? Well, sometimes when we tell people this, and it's like, no, I get it. And then finally, we would say, no, I just want to know, do you go to bed mad? And they always said yes. We found there were 1,000 couples in this study group. We found 3 of the happy couples that said they never went to bed mad. Because in reality, what they had learned is that there were times where you have 2 upset, exhausted, angry people who are trying to duke something out at 1 a.m. At some point, nothing good is going to come from that point on, right? And then we found what I thought was one of the biggest aha moments, the most important pieces of this puzzle. It turns out the most important thing isn't what they did the night before. The most important thing is what they did the next day. It turns out that when you wake up in the morning, half the time, you're kind of find that having a good night's sleep sort of solved the thing, and you wake up and you're like, what was that about, right? But they found that if that issue was still there the next day, the happy couples didn't let it go. They addressed it. Everybody else on the survey, not the yes couples, but the generally happy couples and the so-so couples, they were far more likely, if that issue was still there the next day, they were far more likely to just sort of hope it floated away and not deal with it. The happy couples didn't do that. If it was still there, they dealt with it. Now, I will tell you that this was an occasion of great angst for me as I was recognizing what I was hearing. Because in every other study we have ever done, we've now done interviews and surveys with more than 20,000 men and women. We're in the middle of our 9th nationally representative research study over the course of the last 16 years. We've done a lot of these. And this was the first occasion where it was a little bit different than what I was used to, because in every single one of these other studies, what we found through this rigorous scientific approach backed up what the Bible had said all along. We found the exact same thing Scripture has been saying all along. And suddenly, in this one, I was really conflicted because all of those happy couples all referenced Ephesians, don't let the sun go down on your anger, right? It's really important to not let the sun go down in your anger. They all said that. And so I was really conflicted. Like, does it matter if it's what the happy couples do, if it's unbiblical? Like, I didn't know what to do with this. I felt like, to be honest to the science, I had to say what I'd found, but am I steering people away from the Scripture? I was really wrestling with this as both a social scientist and a follower of Jesus. And finally, a pastor who was also a counselor, when I was explaining how conflicted I was, he started laughing. He was like, I need to show you something. And he pulled out that verse in Ephesians in his old-fashioned printed Bible, as opposed to the ones that's on your phone, right? And if you look, and he said, look at this, and he pulled out that Ephesians 4:26, I think. And first of all, just as a quick aside, that passage in Ephesians isn't even referring to marriage. It's referring to living in community and all that, but setting that aside for a minute. Pulling out his paper Bible, he pointed to that verse, and he said, look at that little caret. You know how sometimes you see in the Bibles, there's a little star or a little cross, and it references to another scripture? There's a tie there. I had never noticed this before, but Paul, when he was saying this, he was actually quoting a verse in the Old Testament. He was quoting a verse in the Psalms to his audience, which his audience would have been very familiar with. And the context of the overall verse is, in your anger, do not sin. Don't let the sun go down on your anger, okay? He was quoting Psalms 4:4. You can go look it up. He was quoting Psalms 4:4. Psalms 4:4 says, in your anger, do not sin. Think about it overnight and remain silent. And so the apparent issue is, in your anger, don't sin. If you need to duke it out at 1 a.m. to not sin in your anger, do that. But if you need to think about it overnight so you don't sin in your anger, do that. Because that was one of the things that a lot of the happy couples had found, is that somebody would say something that they regretted the next morning. Someone would agree to something that they felt like railroaded into and they'd resent it the next day. And that in reality, that there is a benefit in waiting and actually getting a good night's sleep, and that if the issue is still there, to deal with it. Now, I will make a little note to all the husbands in the room. Think back to what I said in the last thing about the little things that matter to men and women. For your wife, if the equivalent of the black cloud of doom is hanging over your head when it's late at night and you're arguing, you may be able to click that off and go to sleep. She's going to be staring at the ceiling all night, okay? It's really important before you go to sleep to resolve that by being able to say, look, we're okay. I need to sleep, but we're okay. So just a quick note about that. Okay, moving on. Next topic that we found was really, really impactful. So I want to tell you an example of a couple that we talked to who did something, and I'm going to ask you to diagnose. I'm going to tell you this little story. I'm going to ask you to diagnose what he was doing. So I would always ask these couples, it was kind of fun actually, the happy couples, I would always ask them to take me through their last argument, their last fight, and hope that, we weren't causing marriage problems when they drove away from talking to us. But one of the guys, this was a very typical situation. when we said, take us through a last fight, he said, I'll just tell you something that's happened a few days ago. He had apparently been working really long hours, like 70, 80-hour weeks, because his company was trying to land this big deal, this big contract. And it was all culminating on Thursday morning at like 6 o'clock in the morning. He was going to get on the plane and go to some other city and sign this massive contract. So weeks and weeks and weeks. Thursday morning he was going to get on a plane. On Wednesday, he had been working so many hours, he hadn't had a time to get to the dry cleaners, and so he had no clean shirts for this trip. And so his wife, they had 3 little kids, and so he called his wife multiple times and said, look, are you sure you're going to be able to get to the dry cleaners? Because if you can't, I can, but I have to because I have no shirts for this trip. And she's like, yes, honey, yes, it's fine. And he's like, are you sure? He called her 3 times to offer 3 times because he said she could be a little scatterbrained and forget these things and running around with the kids. And she said, no, I got it. He said, I arrived home at 10 o'clock at night to find the dry cleaners was closed and she'd forgotten to get the shirts. And he said, I was so mad. I said, okay, what'd you do? He's like, this is when I always have to diagnose what's going on. He's like, you don't even want to know what I was thinking. I'm like, yes, I do. I want to know exactly what you're thinking. And so here's what he said he did. He's like, I went stomping downstairs. I was so upset. Apparently he does carpentry, like as sort of a way of like a hobby or whatever. So he said, I went stomping downstairs to my workshop and I'm down there with the pieces of wood and I've got a rubber mallet and I'm pounding the wood together. And I'm like, okay, what are you thinking? And he said, I'm thinking I'm so furious because I asked her 3 times and she does this all the time. And he was like explaining this. And then he said, but that's not really fair because I know the kids were sick and the baby was needing to go to the doctor, and then she had to stand in line at the pharmacist's office and then have to go all the way across town for the other medicines, and, he's going on and on and on. And then, she still had to go to the grocery store and make us dinner, and she always makes us dinner no matter what's going on. Every night she makes sure to make dinner no matter how late I'm home, and she's such a good wife, and why am I being such a jerk? Do you see what he did? Diagnose for me. What did he just do? Wasn't just that he forgave her. He started thinking about the positive to talk himself out of being mad. That's something that we found the happy couples did, not universally, but in huge numbers, that they focused on the things that were good and excellent and lovely and worthy of praise rather than the things that were worthy of driving them crazy. Philippians 4:8. It's one of my favorite verses in the Bible. Philippians 4:8. They, in the middle of something that was a legitimate concern, they focused on the good things to talk themselves out of being mad. And I need to wrap this up. How much time do I have, by the way? Because my countdown clock just went into negative numbers. I have 9 minutes? Okay. Thank you, Chris. This was a powerful, powerful surprise, a powerful mechanism, because it is so easy for us when we are upset, legitimately upset and legitimately angry. It's not just that we can stew on something. It's truly that we can talk ourselves further and further and further into being upset about this, and further and further and further into hopelessness, when instead an answer can be as close as finding the good that is there all along and focusing on that, even though this other thing is still out here, focusing on that thing that's going to change our minds, that's every bit as real as the thing that's driving us crazy. Incredibly important for us to sort of put that type of thinking cap on when we're upset. And the problem is when we're upset is when we least want to do that, right? When we're upset is when it's really easy to want to wallow in being upset. So the question is, do you want to wallow or do you want a happy marriage? Because it looks like those two things are mutually exclusive. And it makes all the difference in the world if you will focus on the positive. I'll give you a little example of this. So Jeff, we have had many marriage issues in years past because I am, unfortunately, in our marriage, I am the messy one and Jeff is the neat one. And so for any of you women out here who are the neat ones and you're frustrated that your husband is messy at times, can I just beg for grace on the part of the messy person in the relationship? Because it's just not a thing for me. It's just, I didn't get that gene. And I hope my mom never sees this video, but like my mom is the most amazing, wonderful human being on the planet, but she didn't know how to keep things neat either, so I never learned it. Literally, when I was 12 years old, we were out walking the neighborhood, and we came home to find police cars in front of our home. And another neighbor, a friend, had come over to have a cup of coffee or something and had called the police because she thought our house had been ransacked. I never learned how to keep a neat house. And I try. It's not that bad. I try. But it would drive Jeff absolutely crazy that I would pile up mail on the island or whatever. Or, the kids' Legos and toys would be over the living room floor. Or my shoes would be sitting in the kitchen where they had no right to be or whatever. And it would just bug him so much. And he would pray and ask God, help me figure out how to deal with this. And then one day, he felt like the Lord said, look at those Legos. Look at those shoes. Look at that mail stacked up on the island. Yeah, that drives you crazy, but that's a sign that you have a wonderful wife who adores you and 2 little kids who think you are the best thing ever. And you could be living in that perfectly neat, pristine apartment back in Boston and be all alone. And how grateful you should be that even though, this stuff drives you crazy, think about how grateful you are. That's a sign that you have a wife you prayed for and 2 little kids that you love and who love you. And he said it completely took away that malaise, that black cloud of doom that was about that issue. And I would encourage you guys, whatever that issue is that drives you crazy, when you get into an argument, stop yourself the next time and look for those things that are excellent and lovely and worthy of praise and focus on that. You'll find that it actually stops that train of thought even before it gets started. Okay, final thing, just as a real quick one. So one of the other topics, really simple, is that we found that no matter what the happy couples, how they viewed each other, all the things that they did, one of the primary things that they considered about the other person was they considered that their spouse was their best friend. And no matter what, they treated their spouse first and foremost like a best friendship. Now, studies have been done on what makes somebody best friends. What are the things that actually make you able to be best friends with somebody? And the studies have found the greatest predictor of friendship is absolutely not what you would think it is. If I were to ask you guys what do you think the greatest predictor of friendship is, you'd probably say the same things that I did. Because I would have said, I don't know, shared attitudes, similar temperaments, similar values, those kinds of things. And instead, those are a distant second, third, and fourth. The number one predictor of friendship is geographic proximity. You are the best friends with the people that you see the most often. And we all know that's true because we've all had really, really close friends who moved away or we moved away. And you still care about each other, you still love each other, but you just don't see each other as often. You're not as intimate, you're not as close. And it works the exact same way in marriage. Is that the most happily married couples, regardless, and there were couples who were deployed, there were couples who traveled away from each other for business all the time in this group. regardless of what their lifestyle was, they made it a point to treat each other like best friends who had to see each other or talk or communicate often in order to keep their friendship with each other tight. And this is honestly one of the things that happens when you get into tension with the other person. It's really easy to want to avoid the other person so you avoid the conflict. And actually, that's the worst thing that you can do. The happy couples had found, and we had many couples in this study group who had gone from being really in number 3, 4, or 5 categories to being yes couples. And this was one of the main things that got them there, is instead of avoiding the temptation to avoid each other, they spent more time together, not less, to rebuild their friendship. Final little example. I was talking to one of the women who had been in a really, really troubled marriage. I mean, to the point that they were really seriously considering divorce, and the only thing keeping them together was they had 3 little kids, and they didn't want to give up on this vow they'd made before God. And she said, I looked at our calendar, and I looked at how much time each week, these 3 little kids were very busy, and they were very busy. She said, I looked at how much time each week we spent together just talking, just hanging out as friends, the way we used to, kind of. Not dealing with, schedules and logistics, but just talking. She said it was about 15 minutes a week. And she's like, no wonder we're having these marriage problems. We're not even friends anymore. We don't even like each other. And so she looked at her schedule and she said, what can I do to change it? And there was very little without rearranging everything, but she realized twice a week her husband took their 7-year-old to t-ball practice twice a week. And she said, there is no reason in the world that I have to load up the 2 younger children to drive with him to t-ball twice a week, except that is 20 minutes there on the way and 20 minutes back twice a week. And she said at the beginning, that is all she changed, and it completely changed their marriage because they were now spending that extra 40 minutes, those 2 days, just talking and sharing and catching up. And they started to like each other again. And that one thing allowed the spark of a lot of the other things that had to happen in order to restore their marriage. I would really encourage you to look from, if you have a good marriage and want to make it great, spend more time together. If you have a marriage that's struggling in some areas, spend more time together, just as friends. You'll see the difference that it makes. So I thank you guys for coming to this. I know we're out of time. I really do want to do the raffle. But I really, really hope that you guys will realize, out of everything that we've said, let me just leave you with this note, this thought. Everything that we've said, I hope you see how incredibly simple these things are. They're like teaching the moms to not strain the shrimp out. Even just one of them will make a big difference. So my suggestion for you is pick one. Don't try to do them all. Just pick one, and you'll see the difference that it makes. Okay?
Let's thank Shaunti.
Thank you, guys.